Good evening. Thanks to all of you for being here. My name is Melinda Brown Donovan. I'm Associate Director of Continuing Education for the School of Theology and Ministry. And our mission is to offer events online with C21 online enrichment courses, non-credit courses, as well as on campus, like this event. I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for this lecture as part of our year-long on-campus program around the topic of hope for healing. We have a full roster of events coming up, and if you haven't seen it, I invite you to take one of these brochures that are available at the entrance. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to a conference that we're holding on April 2nd, entitled Healing God's People. This conference has an upper limit to the enrollment. It is filling up fast, and if you're interested in registering, I encourage you to do that soon. Now it is my honor to introduce our presenter. Catherine M. Mooney is Associate Professor of Church History at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Prior to the formation of the School of Theology and Ministry in 2008, she served on the faculty at Weston Jesuit School of Theology beginning in 2001. She holds the Master's in Theological Studies degree from Harvard Divinity School and master's degrees and a PhD in medieval history from Yale University. Previously, Professor Mooney served as visiting scholar and coordinator of the Gender Studies program at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, and spent many years teaching in Argentina, New York City, and at the Virginia Commonwealth University. In 2009, she was awarded a research fellowship and served as visiting professor of Franciscan Studies at the Franciscan Institute in St. Bonaventure, New York. Professor Mooney is the editor of a collection of essays, including two of her own, entitled Gendered Voices, Medieval Saints and Their Interpreters. She is also the author of the biography Philippine Duchesne, A Woman with the Poor, which chronicles the life of one of the first saints on the American frontier to be canonized by the papacy. Both of these books are available at a 20% discount from the Boston College Bookstore, which has a table set up in the hallway. She has also written numerous book chapters, articles, and book reviews, as well as the forthcoming book, Ruling Female Penitents, Clare of Assisi and the 13th Century Church. Professor Mooney has a variety of interests and specializations evident in the courses she teaches here at the School of Theology and Ministry. These include spiritual autobiography, Jesuit ministry and spirituality, saints and sanctity, history of Western Christianity, classic texts on prayer and Christian mysticism, and Ignatian spirituality. Last semester, she taught an entire course on the three doctors of the Church, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Ávila, and Thérèse of Lisieux. This evening, we are delighted that she will be speaking on these three women doctors and the lens that they provide on hope for today. Please join me in a warm welcome to Professor Cathy Mooney.
Thank you, Melinda, for that over-the-top introduction. As Melinda noted, my subject tonight revolves around three doctors of the Church, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Ávila, Thérèse of Lisieux, and what they can teach us about hope today. But first, let me say a few words about what it means to be a doctor of the Church. We've all heard the phrase, but perhaps wonder what it means precisely. How does someone get that title? Well, simply put, these are individuals whose theological and spiritual teachings have been singled out for their profound Christian wisdom. We don't even know how the first doctors of the Church were selected. In contrast to the canonization of saints, There is no set process governing this decision. The first 8 theologians recognized as doctors probably rose to prominence quite spontaneously by virtue of the widespread respect accorded to their teachings. So in the Western Latin Church, they included Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. And in the Eastern Greek Church, they were Athanasius, John Chrysostom, Basil, and Gregory Nazianzus. If you Google their names together, whoever thought of Googling the names of the doctors of the Church, you'll see that the 4 Western doctors, and to a lesser extent the Eastern doctors, were often depicted together in paintings, frescoes, stained glass windows, and so forth. The next doctors after these were added only in the 16th century, which was over 1,000 years after most of these first doctors lived. The papacy by this time had established its juridical ascendancy over Western Christendom, so from this point forward, it was left to the discretion of popes to decide who might be called Doctor of the Church. 2 doctors were added in the 16th century. A pope who had been a Dominican friar added a Dominican theologian, Thomas Aquinas, and in a bit of tit-for-tat in the ongoing rivalry between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, 20 years later, a Franciscan pope added, you guessed it, a Franciscan, St. Bonaventure. 20 more names brought the total to 30 doctors of the Church by 1969. We needn't detain ourselves with each individual, but there are some interesting demographic observations. And I put these forth if any of you are trying to gauge your chances for becoming a doctor of the Church in the future. It will first of all help if you are Italian. Over 1/3 of all the doctors of the Church are Italians, a fact probably reflecting both their physical proximity to Rome and the fact that most of the popes who appointed them were Italian. The leading ethnicities of the doctors of the Church, in fact, mirror the ethnical breakdown of canonized saints. So it's Italians leading first, and then second French, and then third Spaniards. All the doctors of the Church until 1969 were ordained. One was a deacon, the rest were priests. For those of you in the audience tonight who are ordained or planning to become ordained, the factor that might most improve your chances to become a doctor is to be named bishop. Over half of all the doctors were bishops or better. Only 2 were popes. Now, you will have noticed, of course, that all of these 30 doctors up until 1969 were men. And perhaps that's not surprising. In most places until the 20th century, and sometimes well into the 20th century, women were not allowed to attend universities, much less be permitted to pursue advanced studies in theology. Despite that, there are women in the distant past who developed sophisticated theologies and penned very well-received treatises. The 12th century Hildegard of Bingen will be someone who's known to many of you, and an even more compelling example to my way of thinking is Julian of Norwich a few centuries later. She ought to be named a doctor of the Church. But it's only in the past few decades that we've begun to recover these women's writings and to plumb them for the wisdom they have to offer to the Church. In 1967, a Catholic scholar wrote in the New Catholic Encyclopedia that no woman could ever be named Doctor of the Church because women were, by nature, incapable of fulfilling such a high-teaching office. Perhaps we should forgive his ill-timed essay. He was articulating only what many people then presumed. So this brings me to my first hope. There'll be 4 tonight, just to prepare you. Unbeknownst to that Catholic scholar and most of the world, Pope Paul VI, in that very same year, 1967, had formally asked prelates in the Vatican who oversaw the canonization of saints, could the title Doctor of the Church be conferred on a woman? Now, he wasn't asking about any particular woman. He just wanted to know if any woman could ever be named doctor. Now, it's important to consider the historical context of the Pope's dramatic gesture. In the late 1960s, books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had already become the subject of noisy debate. In the United States, to take just one example of a Western country, a presidential committee on the status of women had been established. an array of laws against discrimination based on sex were being promulgated in various countries. In the church, in the wake of Vatican II, women were about to be allowed to proclaim scripture readings, lead the prayers of the faithful, act as ushers, and collect offerings. Perhaps it's only the white-haired in tonight's audience who can remember just how revolutionary were these changes. To the Pope's question, so obviously rooted in the same soil that was generating these other changes, the prelates unanimously responded, yes, a woman could be called Doctor of the Church. Now, looking backwards from our perspective today, over 40 years later, we might think that this was a mild change, a no-brainer. But at the time, it was part and parcel of a sea change rearranging the roles of men and women, a change that's still taking place today. These changes were difficult, they were profoundly unsettling for many people, and they were divisive even among people of goodwill. And I suppose we could say the same thing today. Paul VI and the prelate's decision was a case of church leaders listening to the signs of the times. But importantly, they were not acting alone, but in concert with deep movements evident among the faithful at large, and beyond the church, across the world in which the church abided. The lesson for hope here? It would be tempting, and I think simplistic, to isolate this episode as good and contrast it with others that haven't matched my, or perhaps your, expectations. We all, of course, have the responsibility to make such determinations in accordance with a good conscience, and to speak the truth as we see it. What we too easily forget, however, is how difficult these moments of negotiation are when they are happening, when opinions are polarized. The temptation to quit listening to others who hold different viewpoints can be overwhelming. It takes courage to stay engaged and believe that the Holy Spirit's voice will ultimately, if not in the present, in the future, be heard through the din of our own discords. The lesson of hope is that ancient Christian traditions, handed on from one generation to the next, are renewed as they are received. What once seemed immutable to that scholar writing in the New Catholic Encyclopedia was, after thoughtful reflection, judged not to be essential to the tradition. After almost 2,000 years of Christian history, and in analogic sync with the drift of many movements throughout the world, the highest authorities in the church said a woman could become a doctor of the church. To paraphrase a recently resurrected quotation of Martin Luther King, I would say this: the arc of Catholic tradition is long, but it bends toward truth and justice. We know that this is so because in his last discourse to the disciples, Jesus promised that we would be given another advocate, the Spirit of truth, who would always be with us. Now, Catherine of Siena takes this lesson about hope one step further for us. She, along with Teresa of Ávila, was named Doctor of the Church by Paul VI in 1970. Truth and justice are central concepts in Catherine's theology, but they are only spiritually operative when they are framed in love. But first, who was Catherine of Siena? Believe it or not, we're still making many new discoveries about Catherine's life. When Paul VI made her a Doctor of the Church in 1970, most people had no or only partial access to her writings, and she has many writings. Misconceptions about Catherine still abound. Many people think she was a Dominican nun, but Catherine was a laywoman. Her family has often been called poor, but recent archival work shows conclusively that she came from a modestly prosperous middle-class family. Born in the 14th century, in Siena, Italy, Catherine was the 24th of 25 children, all born from the same mother. It makes you wonder if the right person in that family was canonized. I think I hear the mothers laughing a little bit more than other people. Quite early in life, Catherine felt called to be a friar in the Order of St. Dominic. Realizing that door was closed, however, she decided instead to join a group of laywomen who each resided in her own home, but lived according to many of the Dominican ideals. Other misconceptions about Catherine are particularly revelatory. Catherine has suffered the fate of many saints. The farther away we move from the saints' actual lives and from their writings, the less human they seem and the more miraculous they become. This is usually because hagiographers, those who write about the saints and make them known to the world, play up the saints' extraordinary virtues and deeds while passing over in silence their foibles and peccadillos. Saints' lives as a genre aim to inspire and edify the faithful. So it is not surprising that hagiographers take some liberties, sometimes embellishing the saints' virtues, other times even inventing a miracle or two to drive home the moral of their story. Today, however, we've entered a new age, one that perhaps longs for saintly figures closer to our own lives, people with whom we might more realistically identify, lives we can emulate, if not in every respect, certainly in some. A few years ago, when it was revealed that Mother Teresa suffered anguished doubts about the faith, it was telling how that fact made many people admire her more. She was suddenly closer to all of us. Catherine's life and teachings were embellished in three important areas. First, she has been repeatedly represented to us as an uneducated woman who is entirely illiterate, or at best, semi-literate. Many women saints have been misportrayed in this very way. When Pope Pius II canonized Catherine in 1461, he emphasized that she had not acquired her knowledge by human means. She had not developed any of her teachings by dint of her own study or reading or any other human methods. Catherine's wisdom, said Pius, was not human wisdom, it was superhuman wisdom. That's a direct quote. It was something that came from beyond the earthly realm. In 1970, Pope Paul VI reiterated these very same points when he proclaimed her Doctor of the Church. We have the picture of a saint who is, as it were, an empty canal. Heavenly knowledge flows from on high. It travels untouched through this holy vessel that is Catherine and is delivered, unsullied by any human mediation, to the rest of humankind. But historians looking into Catherine's background universally acknowledge that Catherine was indeed literate and educated, and that her human effort was most certainly involved. The earliest historical mention of Catherine, written while she was still alive, in the year she was just beginning to become famous, reports that she read about the saints and she read other holy books. These would have been in her native Italian. But we have evidence that Catherine later struggled hard to learn how to read Latin as well, because she wanted to be able to recite the liturgical office. We know also that Catherine worked hard to learn how to write. Now, however much Catherine might have felt she was assisted by God in these endeavors, and she felt she was, it's indisputable that her own efforts helped her acquire these skills. Catherine also learned about the faith and cultivated her theology the way many people did in her day, and perhaps our own, by listening to learned sermons and conversing at length with learned people, in her day mostly men, not only Dominicans, but also Augustinians and others. Now, why does this matter? It matters because the trope of the unlearned female, who's miraculously imbued with divine knowledge, plays into an old stereotype laid on women, that their learning and teaching is not their own, but is God's alone. Now, ostensibly, this is a compliment. Who among us would not want to be a mouthpiece able to transmit God's perfect divine word? But tellingly, it's a claim seldom made in the same dramatic terms for men. Holy men's learning and teaching is typically ascribed both to God and to the men's own human intelligence and learning. Making Catherine and other women so thoroughly otherworldly diminishes their human agency. Catherine becomes a passive recipient rather than an active contributor, freely collaborating with God by using the gifts God gave her and that she developed. The second misconception about Catherine is related, and that is that she was first and foremost a mystic. Those of you who know a bit about Catherine will perhaps be familiar with the account of how she dictated her lengthy spiritual treatise, the Dialogue. They said she did it in the space of just 5 days, and the entire time she was wrapped in ecstasy. Susan Nafke and other Catherine of Siena scholars today can prove that the treatise was written over a period of about a year, and that Catherine went back to the text and reworked various sections to work it into a more coherent whole. Now, in addition to her dialogue, we have almost 400 letters, some very lengthy, that open a window into Catherine's theology and her deeds. The Catherine most of us know depends more on the saints' lives fashioned about her than they do on her own writings. But comparing Catherine's own account of herself in these letters and the dialogue with these vitae, these saints' lives, point up some glaring discrepancies. Her hagiographers would have us believe that she was an exotic mystic. In a letter written the year before she died, Catherine recounts an intense personal encounter with God, and Catherine always uses very extravagant language. She's famous for this. For the sake of church reform, to which Catherine had dedicated her entire life, she offers her heart to God in this letter. And the picture I've given you of Catherine is a famous painting of this episode in which she exchanges her heart with God. And in this letter, she has a prayer. She prays to God that God accept her heart. And she says that she had an experience after saying this to God, that God somehow tore her heart from her and squeezed it over the whole church. That's this extravagant language. Now, what in Catherine's letter appears as a colorful metaphor of speech regarding her willingness to give her life for the church is transformed in the saints' lives written about her into a real physical episode in which Christ shows up one day, opens up her chest, you can imagine one of those hospital programs, rips out her heart, and then he closes it up. Thank you. On another day, he comes back, he opens up her chest again, and he puts his own heart into it. So lost in the hagiographies about Catherine, who vaunt the interiorly focused mystic, is that she also, first and foremost, saw herself not as a mystic, but as a disciple who spent her life actively intervening in public affairs. When the Pope of the time was at war with the people of Florence, she traveled to Florence to lobby the town leaders. Because the Pope was residing in southern France instead of Rome where he belonged, she traveled to France and said to the Pope, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to go back to Rome, and he subsequently did. This was Gregory XI. She preached publicly everywhere she went, and when at one point in her life she realized that her words were ephemeral, she started employing scribes to write them down for her because she wanted her words to stay around. These are the letters, and many of them are much like homilies, that survive today. Analogous to the way women's leadership roles used to be defined primarily as private, to be exercised within the home, mothers caring for children, so too have holy women like Catherine been redefined as above all private individuals who belong in interior spaces, whether it's the interior space of their soul or in a monastery. But Catherine's intense interior experiences, which she indeed had, were inextricably tied in her mind to her public mission as a disciple, helping change things. Now, leaving to one side the Catherine created by her hagiographers, what compelling lesson of hope do I think she might leave us today? Catherine's term for God, or one of her favorite terms for God, was first truth. And she unceasingly spoke this truth to power. Someone told me recently that he admired Catherine because Catherine, quote unquote, told the Pope what to do. Now, Catherine's criticisms of church authorities were shockingly unrestrained. She told Pope Gregory XI not to listen to his evil counselors. she called those prelates around the Pope the voice of incarnate devils. She typically began these, should I call them a tirade? With humility, but she always ended with a bang. So, for instance, in one letter to the Pope, she writes, "Forgive my presumption in saying this. This is God's will. God is asking you to take just action against the multitudinous crimes of those prelates who graze and feed in the garden of Holy Church. God says that animals should not be eating what is meant for human beings. If you don't intend to use your authority, you should resign. If I were in your place," she's writing to the Pope, "I would be afraid of incurring divine judgment." And she concludes this letter with a pointed, and this is again a quotation, "Don't make it necessary for me to complain about you to Christ crucified." There are many examples. Now, this is the Catherine who's become so popular in the past few decades, a valiant laywoman putting the Pope and other prelates in their place. And that's the person that this person I was talking to wanted to know. But let me ask, how did Catherine get away with this? Well, this fiery Catherine is only one part of the story. Catherine also loved the Pope. She addressed him as Holy Father, but she also called him Babbo, which in English would translate Daddy. She revered the church, and she believed its ministers were designated by God to preach and teach the word. It's because she believed this so respectfully that she became so harsh when she had to talk to them about not fulfilling those duties. So her lesson of hope for us is also a challenge. First of all, we have to be more courageous about speaking truth to power. But second, and this is the harder part, this will only be effective, it will only be received by those in power if we begin in authentic humility and speak with true love. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Only when both conditions are filled can we hope that whatever truth we might speak will itself be received with love. And a further corollary of this, of course, is that when we are on the receiving end of some of these harsh truths, we have to learn how to receive those truths with love, as Pope Gregory did when he listened to Catherine. Now, love is also central to Teresa of Avila's theological teaching, but Teresa suggests a somewhat different hope than Catherine. She stresses not so much the promise of church reform when truth and love are bound together, as the accessibility of love, of God's love, in the life of every human being, however ordinary. This is surprising at first glance because Teresa was far from being an ordinary person herself. In contrast to Catherine, the very public laywoman, Teresa decided to become an enclosed nun. In 1535, when she was 20, she joined a Carmelite monastery in her hometown of Ávila, Spain. The Protestant Reformation was already sweeping through Western Europe, and in Spain, the Inquisition was particularly active. They were on the lookout for anyone whose teaching might be false or might undermine in any way the authority of the Church. Like her contemporary, Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, Teresa would have a number of very unfriendly encounters with these spiritual police. Her advocacy of interior mental prayer, what she called an intimate sharing between friends, made her suspect to some of the authorities. The fear was that if someone could encounter God in the depths of their own interior, they might not feel any need to communicate with God via the external mediations offered by the Church, mediations like the sacraments, the Mass, traditional vocal prayer, and devotional practices. But meet God within the depths of her own soul, Teresa did. And it is surely no coincidence that among her many confessors, there were not a few Jesuits who were themselves practicing interior mental prayer. It was a Jesuit, in fact, together with a Dominican, who finally asked Teresa to write down an account of her life. They wanted her to describe in detail how she came to experience certain interior mystical graces. She was already 50 when she began this lengthy autobiographical work. Now, there are a number of parallels between Catherine and Teresa. Even though Teresa was an enclosed nun, her decision to found a new type of Carmelite monastery threw her into the thick of public politics. Before she died at age 67, she had founded 17 new Carmelite monasteries for nuns and 2 monasteries for Carmelite friars. Her split with the monastery she had first entered, her founding a new order of Carmelites ostensibly in competition with the one she left, gained Teresa many enemies, including high-ranking ecclesiastics and civic authorities in virtually every Spanish town where she went to found a monastery. She was far more politically astute than Catherine. Teresa knew how to work the system, as it were. If one superior or confessor said no to her, for example, she might do an end run and go to that person's superior, or again to that person's superior until she got her way. In one memorable instance, when Teresa could win no one in authority in Spain to her side, when she was trying to found a new type of monastery, the Virgin Mary appeared to Teresa and told her that the Lord himself did not want her to obey any of her superiors. Instead, the Lord wanted her to write directly to Rome to get the Pope on her side. Now, one might cynically see this as a convenient, timely vision that was very self-serving. But I think it more accurately reveals how convinced Teresa was that her mission was God's mission. She was clearly speaking from her own experience when she characteristically counseled others to act with, and this is a quote, a very determined determination, which sounds even more emphatic in Spanish, una muy determinada determinación. When a bishop, local authority, or any religious order might oppose one of her new foundations, Teresa not only pulled out every stop to win them over to her side, or vanquish them if she had to, she also interpreted their opposition as ultimately the work of the devil. This public, full steam ahead Teresa is relatively unknown to most of us. And in part, this is because of Teresa's hagiographers who, like Catherine before her, vaunted her for her mysticism, but not for her public achievements. Almost no one bothers to read her lengthy book, The Foundations, in which she recounts in blow-by-blow detail how she managed to found each of her 19 houses. Sometimes she and her sisters, who were to reside in the new foundation, would slip into a town at night, set up some sort of makeshift dwelling, replete with a chapel and the Eucharist, and confront the townspeople with a fait accompli in the morning when they woke up. Teresa is instead mostly known primarily as a mystic and contemplative. Her most famous image is Bernini's Teresa in Ecstasy, which I have on the handout. Teresa swoons backward in ecstatic bliss, while a smiling, androgynous angel plunges a flaming arrow into her. The erotic overtones are impossible to miss. And while Bernini's portrayal of Teresa is based on her own description of a mystical encounter, it also obscures her more active side, not only her public works, but also the effort she says all beginners in the life of prayer have to put into it before they gradually learn how to let God take over. Now, Teresa wrote 3 significant works on prayer, contemplation, and mystical encounters, so there is justification for viewing her as a mystic. The first treatise was inserted into her autobiographical book after she had finished its first draft. Although she lived for some 17 years after finishing that autobiographical work, it was never released to the public during her lifetime. Various authorities, including the Inquisition, worried about its contents. They were afraid it might mislead weaker souls. But Teresa was determined to have her teaching on prayer get out. Especially among her Carmelite sisters, she thought it would be important. So she wrote another book called The Way of Perfection. And in this work, she shrewdly interlaces comments throughout it to make it more palatable to the scrutinizing authorities. She noted her lack of learning, I don't really know that much, her poor writing style, She says, if there's anything wrong in here, correct it. And she returns to these phrases repeatedly. Censors did force some changes in this work, and I'll give you one example. Teresa was explaining why her nuns should believe that they, despite being nuns and women, still had a role to play in reforming the church of her day and interceding on behalf of theologians and priests. Teresa then shifts in the book directly into the genre of prayer, and she addresses God directly. And she says this: "You, Lord, when you walked in the world, did not despise women. Unlike men of this world, who hold women suspect and find no virtue in them, you, Lord, found much love and more faith among women than you did among men." That passage was yanked. We have it because we have the first version that was censored. Teresa's final treatise on prayer, The Interior Castle, is considered by many people to be her greatest work. She wrote it when she was 62. This was some 5 years before she died. Playing off the gospel verse, "There are many mansions in my Father's house," Teresa describes the progressive journey an individual makes who enters into the life of prayer, a journey which takes one inside oneself, going ever deeper through a series of rooms or mansions until finally reaching the very center of the self, where we find our true selves made in the unsullied image of God. Teresa's discussion of these very last mansions describes when the soul comes so close to God's very image that the individual experiences moments of ecstatic union between itself and God. Teresa describes raptures, visions, locutions, when the individual hears voices, and an array of other exotic phenomena. Now, those who read Teresa seem to be particularly drawn to these last chapters. It's what I call the woo factor. We have an almost voyeuristic fascination in wanting to know what a mystic actually experiences when they come so close to the divine. Does it feel like burning fire? Is it pleasurable? Or is it so pleasurable that it's painful? Or is it so painful that it's almost pleasurable? Reading these chapters can be a bit like gazing at Bernini's Teresa, which in a way it's voyeuristic in another sense. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at it so closely. But the most remarkable thing I find in these final chapters, the lengthiest of her treatise by far, is how Teresa, the mystic, continually turns the readers back to this world, away from exotic phenomena. She says again and again, we should not be searching to have these experiences. This is not what the life of faith is about. Mystical experiences, or often apparent mystical experiences, can be dangerous. They might be from God, but they might be from the devil too, and how do you know? She includes a laundry list of criteria by which we can judge whether or not these experiences or other religious experiences are valid. Do they make you humbler? Or do they make you feel special because you've got them and other people don't? Do they make you feel withdrawn from others? Or do they lead you into the world to do works of charity? Do they lead you into your own peculiar teachings which you think are better than other people's? Or are they in sympathy with what the gospel and church teach? Again and again, Teresa affirms the importance of humility, good works, and gospel faith. These are the signs that one is leading a life in God. Even as she admits to having her own mystical experiences, she wants to rescue all spiritual seekers, even the most ordinary, from thinking that these experiences, these mystical experiences, are necessary to find God. So this leads me to a third hope. Teresa again and again reminded her own nuns that they could find God wherever they were. We all, she said, have an interior cell. We can go into it whenever we wish. There we will find God. In one of Teresa's most famous statements, she told her sisters, quote, "Don't be sad when you're given an obedience to become involved in exterior matters. If you're sent to the kitchen, then know that the Lord walks among the pots and pans, and find God there." So Teresa, this mystic of love, offers us this hope. Loving union with God is possible in human life, however ordinary. Thérèse of Lisieux, the last of these three doctors, is also the most recent doctor to be named. John Paul II made this decision in 1997. Like Teresa, she too offers hope for ordinary Christians. Known principally for her doctrine of the little way, she teaches that anyone, however seemingly inconsequential their lives, can pursue Christian perfection. It doesn't take heroic deeds. We can do it by performing any deed, no matter how minor, as long as we do it with authentic love. Now, Thérèse contrasts in many ways with both Catherine and Teresa. Her own brief life was entirely private. Born into an extremely religious French bourgeois family, Thérèse went from an exceedingly sheltered home life right into a very cloistered Carmelite monastery when she was only 15 years old. You could almost say also that she had no choice but to become a nun. Her father had wanted to be a priest but was turned away. Her mother had wanted to be a religious but was turned away. Their greatest hope for each of their 5 daughters was that they would become nuns, and each one of them did. Thérèse was raised for this, in other words. The Carmel monastery that she entered was home to 3 of her other sisters. The other sister became a visitation nun. Now, Thérèse's life would have gone unnoted by the world very easily. She sometimes spoke of her vocation in grand terms. For instance, once she wrote that she felt within her, and I quote, the vocation of the warrior, the priest, the apostle, the doctor, and the martyr. But of course, she didn't follow any of these paths, which were all closed to her. She was just 24 when she died. It was a particularly agonizing death brought on by tuberculosis. And her life in the Carmel monastery was, in most respects, exceptionally unremarkable. While there, however, she wrote 3 short autobiographical works. After she died, these were put together into a single book known today as The Story of a Soul. An immediate bestseller, the book launched what we might call Thérèse's public life. The way Thérèse of Lisieux has been received in the world suffers not so much from misconceptions, which I find in the cases of Catherine and Teresa, as from varying interpretations. I have had many chances to discuss Thérèse's autobiography in classes that I've taught, and every single time, without exception, this book starts a debate, sometimes a very voluble debate. Everybody reads the same book. Some readers love the book and they love Thérèse. Others are completely turned off, even derisive. What lies at the root of these polarized reactions to Thérèse of Lisieux? I think about this topic every time I teach this book and watch this debate. Let me begin by listing some of the features of Thérèse's life and her manner of writing that draw particular criticism. Her home life was a veritable hotbed of Christian piety, and it strikes many people as completely artificial. When Thérèse writes about these years at home, she paints a highly romanticized picture. Hers was the perfect family. They were always loving. And many readers suspect that she's not being entirely truthful when she tells this story. Other sources, for example, apprise us of the fact that one of Thérèse's sisters, Léonie, was not so easy to get along with all the time. A lot of people thought Léonie was a little bit odd and not quite right in the head. This was the sister, not surprisingly, who entered another monastery. Thérèse expresses herself using extremely sentimental, flowery language that was popular in some 19th century French circles. So many things seem to be little and sweet, perfect little flowers. This goes on throughout the entire work. Thérèse, above all, describes herself as God's littlest flower or God's littlest bird. She sometimes refers to herself as a saint also, and that turns people off. More seriously, there seems to be a morbid attachment to suffering and death. Here's a quote that will, I think, get a rise out of you. Thérèse wants the baby Jesus to, and here I quote, use me like a little ball of no value, which he could throw on the ground, push with his foot, pierce, leave in a corner. When Thérèse, later in life, alone in her cell at night, first coughed up blood, which is one of the signs of advanced tuberculosis, she says this: "I felt something like a bubbling stream mounting to my lips. I didn't know what it was, but thought that perhaps I was going to die, and my soul was flooded with joy." She decides not to tell anyone about this, and she goes back to bed and waits until the next morning. And when she gets up again and confirms that it was indeed blood, she rejoiced all over again. Now, there is a context for Thérèse's attraction to suffering. One strain of French Catholic spirituality at the time stressed that individuals could offer themselves as victims to God to win God's grace for other people in the world. But for every person who is repelled by these things that I've enumerated, there seems to be someone else who's just as strongly attached and attracted to Thérèse. What others label as naive and romanticized, these people receive as innocent and idealistic in the best sense. Thérèse's attraction to death is that, they say, of a mystic, someone who is so in love with God that they can't bear life on earth without God. We're not going to settle this debate tonight. I should note, when the sides are drawn up in battle about Thérèse, I find myself identifying more who find Thérèse a little bit unreal. But because I have seen how Thérèse genuinely inspires others, I've returned to her story to reread it with a hermeneutic of generosity. Tonight, I will share just one lesson of hope I find in Thérèse. Her little way of doing things with much love comes through so strongly throughout her life story that it's easy to disregard how this storyline changes at the very end of her life. Throughout most of the autobiography, she frames herself as the child of the child Jesus, completely trusting in God, unwavering in her faith. But not long before her death, Thérèse began to have occasional doubts. You can almost miss them, because she drops these statements into passages that also contain a lot of sentimental statements about love. She wondered at one point if heaven actually existed. More troubling, she found it hard to believe at another point that God really loved her. She sometimes was drawn back from these precipices and experienced consolations again, but by the end of her life, there was only darkness, and it went on. She wrote that she sang, quote, of the happiness of heaven and of the eternal possession of God, but she felt no joy. Hope number 4. What sustained Thérèse in these dark, dark months, when she both knew she was facing physical death and she thought God's love had been withdrawn, she even doubted it existed? Well, it seems to have been that little way, that doctrine that so many people find laughable. For me, these episodes of doubt suggest that a young, very sheltered girl was growing up. The sentimental faith of her childhood did not work anymore. She needed to reframe it in a more mature and nuanced way. The scriptural quote I would have suggested to Thérèse at that point would have been this: 3 things will last forever: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. The 3 theological virtues are, of course, intimately related. If Thérèse had lived, perhaps she would have later articulated that the small gestures of love she advocated, which she continued to practice in these dark months, somehow captured and expressed the faith she doubted and the hope she thought she'd lost. In our own cynical age, where doubt is not only easy, but often celebrated, Thérèse's courageous refusal to collaborate with it makes her finally seem more like a grown-up. So let me return now to these 4 lessons of hope I've suggested we take from these doctors of the church. First, the fact that 3 women have joined the illustrious list of church doctors confirms our well-founded Christian hope that it is the Spirit who leads us in our journey. The arc of Catholic tradition may progress slowly toward its goal. It may often be bitterly contested, but it will ultimately bend toward truth and justice. In Catherine's hope, we are called to speak the truth in unvarnished terms, even speak it to power in absolutely unambiguous terms, but we should only speak such truth if we can do it with genuine love. Teresa's hope: love of God is not essentially otherworldly. It's not a mystical affair in which we lay back and are passively filled with celestial favors. Authentic love of God is grounded in an active life of charity toward others. It's accessible at any moment to every Christian, however ordinary. And from Thérèse, the little way she offers as a path to God for every Christian, however ordinary, is not a version of Christianity light that substitutes little, inconsequential lives for the magnanimous, heroic lives of Christian tradition. Its little gestures of love have the strength to carry us through the darkest moments of our lives. This love captures, in some sense, the essence of our faith and hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. You really made these doctors come to life, and I'm hungering for more. So thank you. Kathy's agreed to take questions.
Yes.
What is the newest information or opinion on Catherine's refusing to eat food? I mean, it almost sounds at the end of her life as if her body is just collapsing in an anorexic something.
Right. Well, yeah, I didn't mention Catherine's asceticism. It was quite extreme. She, very young, quit eating certain foods, meat, dairy products, and things like that, and was trying to live off vegetables. And if you read both her own texts, she talks about a kind of growing inability to eat. And I think this is something that can be induced. If you go into severe fasting, you can't tolerate foods that you put down. Now, Suzanne Noffke, who I find one of the most balanced interpreters of Catherine, thinks that Catherine later in life regretted her early austerities. Most historians who look at this think that she starved herself to death, that she reached a point where she couldn't eat, and she died at age 33 precisely because she had become so emaciated and weak. We're centuries distant from that time, so this is looking backward. It's hard to know. It doesn't mean that ascetical practices can't be a very good practice, but Catherine herself, I believe, would counsel people to moderate them. There are a lot of other ascetic women in the church. Clare of Assisi is one, and she later in life wrote to one of her most important followers, telling her not to go too far in fasting practices. So I think some youthful exuberance sometimes carries these people away with something, and they go overboard. And here, interestingly, often male confessors helped women. They often told them to knock it off and start eating a little bit. Yeah.
How do you see their lives being repeated today, now?
Well, you know, our age is so different from theirs. I think in terms of the gender question, women can assume public roles that they never could before. They can do things in the church they never could before. They've attained a degree of respect. Women theologians now teach in every school. So I think in a way there are a lot of contrasts. That said, I think that there's still a fruitful debate going on about what women's roles should be. I don't think we're going to solve it tonight. I think it's also the case that there's an accent put on women's interior lives that sometimes is a disservice. So let me give you an example. Women from the past were often depicted as visionaries, even some women who weren't visionaries. And in a way, this kind of puts them up on a pedestal. It makes them greater than their holy male counterparts who weren't as likely to have visions or mystical experiences. But negatively, it takes women out of this world. And a modern example I always think of, I'm not sure if you'll agree with it, is when people start talking about women's intuition, like, ooh, they've got some special power. I don't think they do. I think sometimes women pick up on some signals because they've been acculturated to pick up on them. And conversely, there are men who pick up on certain signals that women are clueless about because of the way we're raised. So sometimes people will celebrate the fact that women are visionaries and they're intuitive. And I usually step back a little bit and I think, well, wait a minute, what are the ramifications of this? I think men and women are all involved in the world. They all have contributions to make. I would agree with Catherine and Teresa that women's role in church reform is as important as men's role. So well, that's a little bit on your question. Yes?
That was great, Kathy. You mentioned Juliet of Norwich, but are there any other women that you could think of they're contemplating or that we might see being named as doctors of the church?
You know, I would have to know the mind of the Pope, and I'd have to know the mind of future popes. You know, I point out to people, we have these 33 doctors of the church, and they're all noted for their teachings, but there is a certain serendipity involved in who gets named. It doesn't mean that these are the 33 absolute best theologians, because there are often historical circumstances that explain why at a particular time someone is named doctor of the church. I mean, to take the three I've talked about tonight, obviously Pope Paul VI was thinking about, well, women. Maybe we need to bring women into this. So there are always historical circumstances. What's going to happen in the future, I don't know. You can go a long time without naming anyone doctor of the church. I think the 17th century named no one. No pope bothered naming anybody doctor of the church in the 17th century. So it's up to each pope. I can't predict that. Yeah. Hi.
First, you had mentioned that in Teresa of Ávila, when she started having confusion, whatever you call it, the rapture, that there are ways of checking it to make sure that it's legitimate from a good source. Is that the Interior Council that list came from?
Yes. I think she mentions it in other works too, but in the Interior Castle she spells it out repeatedly. And not in one place, so you're going to have to read.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, I read it. And when she mentions Jesus helping her to form her first nunnery outside the one she was in, because he wanted to restructure, it seemed very real to me, very possible. Do you feel that that's true? That she really was communicating with Jesus, or she was communicating with her, and genuinely reading her?
Well, I'm ready to accept it. I mean, I think what she did produced a good result. So I think it was of God, however you want to explain how it was of God. You know, if you meet other people who have a mission that they believe is essential to the life of the church, they are going to think that's a mission from God. Now, not everybody's going to be right. But she was that kind of person, and it does seem that she accomplished a great deal of good, so I have no problem accepting that. I don't know that I can explain scientifically exactly what was transpiring. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for your patience.
Thanks again, Kathy, and thanks to all of you for being here. This program was videotaped. It will be available on the STM website as streaming video within about 2 weeks' time. Have a safe trip home and hope to see you again. Thank you.